Well, my name is Wells W. Spicer. I was born around 1831 in Chemung, New York. My parents, William Spicer and Seba Shaw, had 6 children. I was number 5. When I was around 9 years old, we moved to Tipton, Iowa. Now, I lived in a lot of places during my lifetime. I lived in New York, Iowa, Colorado, all over Utah, very many cities, several towns in Arizona, a couple of places in Mexico, that's old Mexico, and also spent some time in a place called St. Louis, Missouri. Now, I know most folks call it Missouri, but my Mormon friends tell me that the proper pronunciation is Missouri. Now, having been there in the summer myself, I think I concur with my friends, but for different reasons, you might understand. Well, I've also done a lot of things in my life. I was a lawyer, I was a publisher, an editor, a journalist, a militiaman, a hotelier. Had to learn a little French to say that word, but let's see, I was a prospector, a miner, a mining engineer. I was an entrepreneur, a politician, and I was a judge several times. Well, you can imagine that all the things I've done and all the places I've been, I've got a few stories I could tell. And I do, but we don't have time for all of that. So let me just tell you a few things, highlights from my life, things that you might find interesting and things that have been meaningful to me. Well, when I was about 22 years old in Iowa, I was admitted to the bar. Now, I'm talking about the legal bar, not the saloon type, but I was admitted to a few of those as well. I then started practicing law. But I also served as a publisher and editor of the Cedar County Advertiser. It was a local newspaper. And it began a part of my life that continued off and on, that of being a journalist. You see, I have a way with words, and I like to have an impact on the people. So I did that from time to time. Well, did that for a few years. And in 1854, I ran for county prosecutor as a Democrat and lost. Well, a couple years later, I ran for county judge as a Republican and I won. You might say I saw the error of my ways. Well, a few years later, while I was living in Iowa, I met the love of my life, Miss Abby Gilbert. We got married, and in 1863, we had a son. We named him Ernest. Well, in the late 1860s, we moved to Utah, and I was admitted to the bar in Utah. I began practicing, mostly mining and mining claims as my specialty, but I also started working for a couple of newspapers. You might have heard of the Utah Mining Gazette and the Salt Lake Daily Tribune. Well, after a few years, I was appointed U.S. Commissioner and was a judge once again, and heard cases in Bingham mostly. After that was finishing up, I leased a defunct lead mine down by Minersville called Rawlins Mine. Well, wouldn't you know it, we discovered a new vein of lead and gold, revitalized the whole area. In 1877, I became involved in a very spectacular and serious trial. It was the trial of Mr. John D. Lee, who was being tried for the Mountain Meadows massacre. Well, I assembled a legal team and we prepared for the trial. And I must say, we were well prepared. My opening argument lasted 3 hours, in which I outlined all the different theories and possibilities for what really happened. I did such a fine job that my client ended up with a hung jury that trial. There was 8 jurors in favor of acquittal and 4 in favor of a guilty verdict. Well, unfortunately for my client, the prosecution retried the case the next year. And they took a different approach, and they won. Got a conviction, and my client was sentenced to death. I appealed, of course, but the Supreme Court denied the appeal. So in 1877, my client, Mr. Lee, was executed by firing squad at Mountain Meadows. I was in attendance. Well, during these trials, other things were happening in my life as well. In 1876, my wife and I separated, although I always considered that we were married for my entire life. I also ended up moving to Silver Reef. I was one of the early residents of Silver Reef, and some folks even called me a founder. And although I'm a bit of a modest man, I must confess that I may have single-handedly been responsible for the success of Silver Reef. You see, I wrote an article that was published over in the Pioche Daily Gazette, Daily Record. And it got folks over there a little bit excited. Let me give you a taste of that article. I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. Recent assays made have demonstrated that what is generally called wall rocks and country rocks of the mines contain silver to the tune of from $20 to $50. This has led to the assaying of many different rocks that lay around loose, revealing the fact that they all contain silver in greater or less degrees. In fact, it is everywhere here, so that a man dare not throw a stone at a mean dog for fear that the stone may be a piece of horn silver that he's just throwing away. And so he stops to examine the rock, and when he's done, the dog has escaped. Well, a bet was offered today of a tub full of wine that a rock could be picked out of the bishop's fence that would assay over $400. In many places in both Leeds and Harrisburg, I've seen globules of silver that have been melted out of the jams and the back of people's fireplaces. In fact, it is everywhere here. In the solid rock, in seams, in veins, bonanzas, and pockets, except for trousers pockets. And there's no mistake about it. Well, of course, when the miners in Pioche heard that, they all stampeded over here. In fact, that's what they called it in late 1876, the Pioche Stampede. And it turned Silver Reef into a booming mining committee, and y'all can just thank me for my work, my fine work. A few years later, I decided it was time to move on. And so I relocated to a small town in Arizona named Tombstone. Seems there had been a silver strike there. Well, it was January of 1880 when I arrived in Arizona. Immediately, I was hired by the Arizona Daily Gazette to write a few articles. I also started practicing law. And by June of 1880, I was appointed the Justice of the Peace of Tombstone. Well, wouldn't you know it, a little over a year later, in October of 1881, there was a gunfight in town. Some of you may have heard about it. They call it the gunfight at the OK Corral. Now, you got to understand, Tombstone was still a little rough at those times. There was a lot of corrals. Some was nicer than others. This one was okay. And so they call it the OK Corral because, it was just okay. Well, you got to tell you, the parties involved, there was this group of ruffians called the Cowboys. And those who were involved from the Cowboys were Billy Clanton and Ike Clanton, Billy Claiborne, and the brothers Tom and Frank McClary. And on the other side were the Marshalls, Marshal Virgil Earp, his brother Morgan, his other brother Wyatt, and their friend Doc Holliday. Well, it seems that the Cowboys were in violation of a local ordinance requiring them to relinquish their firearms when they entered the town, and they refused to do so. So The Earps and Doc Holliday came down to disarm them and make sure that there was a peaceable visit. Well, a gunfight ensued. It lasted all of about 30 seconds, during which time about 30 rounds was exchanged. At the end, the McClary brothers and Billy Clanton were dead, and Virgil and Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday were wounded. Now, Wyatt Earp was unharmed. It was a luck that kind of stuck with him through his life, it seems. But Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne, they were okay too, because they ran away right at the beginning of the gunfight. Well, a few days later, Ike Clanton filed first-degree murder charges against the Earps and Doc Holliday. And being the justice of the peace, on the very same day that he filed those charges, November 1st, I initiated a preliminary hearing. Now, you got to understand, in the Old West, there was a bit of a transient population. They could disappear. And in a case like this, where you had powerful parties on one side, the cowboys, a lot of money and ranchers behind them, witnesses that would defend the Earps might have a habit of disappearing from lead poisoning, I might say. So I thought it was important that the preliminary hearing be very thorough. So I commenced this preliminary hearing on November 1st and finished it up on November 30th. During that time, the cowboys testified that when the Earps arrived, they raised their hands and surrendered. They were peaceful. It was the hands up, don't shoot, argument. Well, the Earps said that they only were defending themselves because the cowboys drew first. Well, in the course of the trial, the doctor that examined the bodies testified that there was a bullet wound on Billy Clanton's wrist that was impossible to get if he had his hands up or if he was holding his jacket open to show that he was unarmed. There was another witness that was very important, Miss Addie, can't remember her last name now, but her name was Addie. The first time she testified, it was very confusing. Couldn't make heads or tails out of what she was saying. So I went and visited at her home and questioned her myself. And once I understood, I invited her back. And on her second visit, I asked her the questions, much to the chagrin of the prosecution. And this time, her testimony was very clear. She testified that none of the cowboy faction raised their hands, and at no time were they trying to surrender. So at the end of the trial, well, I should say the hearing, which became known later as the Spicer hearing, probably because it was the longest preliminary hearing in the history of the world. But anyway, I was very hard on Virgil Earp. I considered that what he had done was censorious and injudicious. You know, getting his brother Wyatt and Doc Holliday involved when they weren't regular marshals but were just deputized for that time just seemed inappropriate in my opinion. But after considering all the evidence, I found that there was no criminality involved in what they'd done. So I set them free, and there was no subsequent trial needed because the preliminary hearing determined that there was no evidence that could possibly end in their conviction. Well, a few years later, I decided it was time to move on again. And I ended up in Pima County, Arizona, doing some prospecting. I then headed down to Sonora, Mexico, doing some more prospecting. I heard of a silver strike over near Tucson, and so I took all my assets and I invested in a mine. Well, unfortunately, the vein was a little shallow, and I lost everything. Around 1887, I wandered off into the desert and was never heard or seen of again. Now, there was 3 theories as to what happened. One, I was so despondent at having lost everything that I wandered off and committed suicide. 2, that I wandered off in the desert, got lost, and died of exposure. Or 3, that I pretended to be despondent and slipped out, never to be seen again, presumed dead, so that my creditors could never find me, and I went down to Mexico and lived out the rest of my life. Well, I'll let you decide. Thank you. Any questions?